Okay, if you could please take your seats and quieten down just a little. You probably don't need to quieten down much because, like me, our next speaker has a large voice and he's not afraid of using it. I've enjoyed many of Stefan's presentations in the past, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he's got to say this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this presentation. It's not going to be a technical talk, unlike the other talks, most of the other talks here at Virus Bulletin, but I think this is a discussion that we as an industry need to have. So I'm going to tell you a story about freedom, essentially, today, because freedom is something that I care about very deeply. But before we start, I want to tell you that when I was a teenager and I was reading George Orwell's 1984, I was surprised and I was intrigued. I was intrigued to see this dystopian future in which every citizen was monitored by their government through these telescreens, which were essentially fictional devices somewhere in between TV sets and security cameras. And the thing was, it was mandatory for every citizen to have such a telescreen in their living rooms. Now, when I look around the world we live in nowadays, I don't see much of a difference. We surround ourselves with smart TVs, smart devices, Internet of Things that have microphones, that have cameras, that have full connections to the Internet. The only difference being that we are the ones to buy these devices and we install them in our living rooms ourselves. So this is going to be a talk about balkanization in the digital age. But before we talk about that, I'd like to take you a little bit back into the past. And I'd like to ask you to imagine a world without borders. A world in which human civilization was able to evolve because of one main reason, which was migration. And this was a world in which the famous Silk Road, which was a trading route connecting 3 continents from Asia to Europe, and civilizations along this trading route were able to evolve not just because they were able to exchange goods and merchandise, but also because they were able to exchange ideas and philosophies about things such as religion, life, or science. So Silk Road was this thing that opened long-distance economic and political relationships between all of these civilizations. And the same principles stood at the core of the internet. When the internet was invented, it was just a small project from university researchers that wanted to better share their information together in a freely and in a timely manner to essentially try to take science to the next level. So back then, of course, it was a very small project. They all knew each other and they all trusted each other. So this is why things such as privacy or security were not really implemented back then, and we're trying to implement them now, to add them now on top of an already shaky foundation, so to say. This is why the internet is inherently insecure, and this is why we're here, and I think it's a good thing that smart minds, like the ones in the room, are trying to tackle these problems. Now, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, had this famous quote that he hopes we will use the net to cross barriers and to connect cultures. And I don't know about yourselves, but when I came here to Montreal, I had to pass through 3 different passport controls and security checks in airports. So nowadays I'm thinking that we live in a world in which borders are everywhere, borders are ubiquitous, and we not only take these borders for granted, but we got used with them and we don't seem to have a problem with them. The thing is that walls and borders usually promote segregation. They have a negative impact on economy, creativity, technology, and they generally slow down progress on every level. And the thing is, while we all understand the benefits of global information sharing and collaboration, we as a society, we haven't reached that level of maturity in which we can quit having borders, in which we can tear down both physicals and virtual borders. So this is the world that we live in nowadays. But what gives me hope is that sometimes we like to jump over some walls, sometimes we even like to tear these walls down. And I think the Berlin Wall is a great example of what human beings can do when they really want to become free. The thing is that right now, less than 3 decades after the Berlin Wall fell and essentially put an end to an era of division between the East and the West, I think that we're on the verge of making the same mistakes all over again, only this time we're making these mistakes in the cyberspace. So balkanization is something that keeps me up at night. And for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with the term, I have to admit I wasn't familiar with the term until a few years ago myself. Balkanization is essentially a geopolitical term, defining the situation in which an area is becoming more and more divided into smaller parts, smaller entities. And these smaller entities, not only they are uncooperative with each other, they might actually become hostile to each other, like actively trying to attack each other. So the thing is, the internet definitely has this natural tendency to be divided, and I think that this is because of differences that we have in things such as culture or language, right? So, for example, we all live in a part of the world in which we browse what I like to call the English-speaking internet, right? When we search for something on the internet, we Google it. But if we're talking about a Chinese-speaking person, they will probably not use Google. They'll probably use Baidu. Or a Russian-speaking person, they will not use Google. They will use Yandex. And I think that this division is okay as long as it's 100% natural, and as long as we're not trying to artificially, raise walls and basically put a stop to the free flow of information. Because the thing is, information is like water. It has a tendency to leak. It has a tendency to get to places where it shouldn't. Just like, two communicating vessels will get filled by the same source of water, the same way information will manage to reach and disseminate throughout all the parts of the world. So, unfortunately, I think not everyone is okay with the current status quo. I mean, if we look around, I think more and more countries are right now building walls on the internet. And I think that the Great Firewall of China is a very good example to illustrate this thing. If we look at the history, the internet entered China in 1994, and the Communist Party back then was very quick to realize that this new network has the power, has the potential of bringing like-minded individuals together, which could really pose a threat to the government. So as quickly as 1997, the Great Firewall of China, its first version, was actually up and running, operational, monitoring internet traffic and blocking access to certain websites. So yeah, that's right. The internet in China, the free internet in China, only lasted for no more than 3 years. So this means that, back then if you would Google pictures of the Tiananmen Square from the Chinese internet, you would only see pictures of a clear blue sky and some nice Asian architecture. If you would Google the same thing from anywhere else in the world, you will see the famous Tankman picture, which became an iconic symbol of the revolution, an iconic symbol of courage all over the world. By the way, I hear that Google is going back to China right now. So the thing is, this is not a Chinese-only problem. This is actually China set the trend in motion. It was the first domino to put this trend in motion. And right now, if we look around the world, there's a huge technical industry that's fueling the growth of internet surveillance. That's fueling things such as censorship and generally the division of the internet. And there's a private industry that unfortunately is thriving on this. Every year, more and more companies are being started up, and their only purpose is to try to find new ways through which they can, attack our computers or through which they can get access to our information. I'm sure that all of you here are very aware of this because of the research that gets published in our industry. And the thing that I don't really like is that usually these companies are based in the green parts of the world, while their victims are based in the red parts of the world. And of course, I understand it. Like money makes the world go round. So without any kind of export restrictions or restrictions to surveillance technologies, they will sell these technologies to the higher bidder. And I think there's nothing that we can do about it. Or maybe there is. There's definitely a discussion that it's worth having.
Who are the yellow countries? Are they doing both?
Probably. So What happens when a certain government cannot or doesn't want to get the information directly by themselves? Well, they can legally compel internet companies to share this data that they have available for their customers. And the thing is, in the past few years, if you look at, for example, Silicon Valley-based companies, they seem to be very willing to cooperate and to agree, essentially, with these requests for information, for personal information, or with these takedown requests or censorship requests, right? So refusing to comply with such requests usually means that that company is not going to do business anymore in that specific country. So maybe the Chinese example is not something that will touch you. Maybe the Chinese example is not something that's very close to you, because China is very far away and we don't really care about what's happening there. But I'd like you to travel to a place closer to home, to my home at least, which is Turkey. I mean, my home is Romania, but Turkey is very close to Romania. And I'd like you to meet Barış Pehlivan, who is a Turkish journalist who in the past years was very critical of the current government in Turkey. Now, Barış's story is very interesting because he was recently released from prison, where he spent more than 1 year and a half behind bars, following an event that kind of went like this. The weekend before his arrest, somebody broke into his office and physically removed the hard drive from his computer, planted some incriminating documents there, and then put the hard drive back. So then when the police discovered those documents, they had a very good reason to arrest Barış. Now, how do we know that Barış was not the one who to put those documents on that hard drive? Well, this was uncovered by security researchers at Arsenal, if I remember right, who did a forensics investigation on behalf of Barış's lawyers. So they analyzed those hard drives, and they published a paper in which you can see exactly what happened there through from the Windows log files. And not only that, the conclusions were that those files were planted on the hard drive at night, on a Friday night at 10 p.m. while his computer was turned off and while nobody was in the office. But even more than that, in the week previous to his arrest, his computer was attacked 12 times with Ahtapot, which is a nation-state-sponsored Trojan. Ahtapot means octopus in Turkish. Now, you might ask yourself, why does all this matters? And the reason why I wanted to tell you Barış's story is to actually try to touch a more important point, which is the fact that the things that we do in this industry matter quite a lot. And it's not always necessarily a simple question of protecting your data. In Barış's case, it was a question of protecting his liberty, his actual physical freedom. And even more than that, when talking about journalists, generally limiting internet freedom is a bad thing for journalism, because journalism is one of the most important pillars of our modern democratic societies. So journalists should always be free to do their jobs. And things such as mass surveillance or targeted attacks, these are things that can stop them in their way of finding sources, agreeing to communicate with sources, and more especially protecting your sources. So doing your job becomes much harder when the internet is not free, when the internet is balkanized, and when surveillance is ubiquitous. The bigger picture, the even bigger picture, is that everybody changes their behavior when they're under mass surveillance. I mean, you don't have to read an Oxford study to understand that, even though there is a study and I recommend you to read it. But I think that all of us had a moment when, maybe we wanted to post a status on Facebook or on Twitter, and then we got a second thought like, hey, what if my employer will read this? What if my friends will read this? What if my family will read this? And then we'll just self-censor ourselves. Like probably half of the people here who have Twitter accounts, they've written in their bio that, these tweets are my own and they're not my employer. So you always have to think what happens if you post something that some people might disagree with. And I think that self-censorship cannot lead to anything good, can it? So the human intellect is not the only thing prospering when information is allowed to flow freely. Our wallets are also prospering. There's a McKinsey study that shows that 21% of growth in the GDP in modern countries is relying on the growth of the internet, so it's directly proportional. So just as civilizations on the path of the ancient Silk Road prospered because of this ancient trading route. In the same way, Ross Ulbricht prospered from the modern Silk Road. Now, Ross Ulbricht was an extreme libertarian, and he really believed that, people should have their own choice with what kind of things they want to buy or what kind of things they want to use. So of course, he set up this underground marketplace, which became essentially the Amazon of illegal things, selling things such as fake IDs, illegal guns, or dangerous drugs. So of course, his website attracted the attention of law enforcement, who seized his website and got Ross Ulbricht arrested. That was the moment when we all realized that Ross Ulbricht became very rich by just being the middleman from all of these illegal transactions. So yeah, the Silk Road, both the Silk Road takedown and the fact that Silk Road existed could not have happened without the internet, could not have happened without international collaboration and without different entities working together and cooperating together. So I think the same thing is happening in our industry, because we couldn't do anything without cooperation. I mean, pretty much every company here in the room analyzes more than 300,000 new malicious software samples every day. And how do we find the needle in the haystack? How do we find those really interesting things that we want to come to Virus Bulletin and talk about and present to the world? Is it the great minds that we have in the industry? For sure, maybe. Is it the bare metal servers that we can all afford to buy and the cloud infrastructure that we can afford to use? Sure. But I think most importantly, it's the fact that we can cooperate. It's the fact that we can share research. It's the fact that we can take somebody else's research and contribute and take that research further. So if I think about it, when I joined this industry more than 10 years ago, and I was a young guy, I think that one of the things that surprised me the most was this vast amount of cooperation that was happening between researchers that were actually working for competing companies. So I was mesmerized by this. But it made sense, because at the end of the day, we're all fighting the same fight. We all have the same goals. So sharing threat data and generally coming together as one in the fight against malware is something that I really love about this industry, about the conferences and everything that we do. But the thing is, when I look around nowadays, I'm not really sure that cooperation and collaboration has such a bright future, because digital nationalism and nationalism generally is a trend that seems to be happening more and more around the world. And looking at all sorts of protectionist legislation that is being drafted up and even passed in different countries, this is why I'm not so optimistic about the future of this. And the thing is, historically, nationalism was a concept that's dating for as back as the 18th century, and it's an ideology that promotes undiscriminated love for your country and for your interests of your nation state. And usually nationalists believe that their nation is more important than collectively what's happening in the human civilization. And I think that this ideology was responsible for both of the world wars that we've had in the past years, past century, and for tens of millions of lives that were lost worldwide. So I'm not a very, very big fan of this. And if you look at what's happening online, because mostly everybody that's online is using social networks, you can see that these cracks and these divisions in our society are being amplified by the internet. We're all organized in our own little bubbles, and the problem is that these bubbles tend to become more and more, let's say, separated, more and more divided with each other. So we were supposed to all be on the internet to connect with each other and to try to understand each other and accept each other, but it turns out that we're using the internet in a way that, it's dividing us. And instead of giving voice to, for example, marginalized groups or giving voice to powerless people, we're giving voice to extremism or things that can really polarize our views. And I think that the inability to understand the differences between us are becoming more and more prevalent. But what can we do about it? The thing is, when I go to conferences and I look around at what we're doing in the industry, I think that we have the tendency to work too much and not to think about what we are working on that much. Like somebody said yesterday in a presentation that it's a hit and run type of approach when we're publishing things. So we're just very excited to find the next big thing and move over and move on. And I think this is a problem with engineers everywhere, not just in the security industry, not just researchers in the security industry. And I think sometimes we need to take a step back, look at the history, try to learn some things, maybe try not to repeat some of the things that, some of the mistakes that the humankind has made in the past. And of course, we need to have a debate about the things that are happening in our industry. So I'm saying all this because I think we have a huge responsibility to every internet users out there as the ones who are trying to protect the data and who are trying to protect human rights at the end of the day, I think. And one parallel which I like quite a lot to draw is the one between computer researchers and doctors and medical doctors. Because cybersecurity researchers are essentially, in my view, the doctors of the future. And just like any medical doctor took the Hippocrates oath and they would essentially treat every patient. Let's say if there's a conflict zone or a war zone, a doctor will treat any patient no matter from what side of the border that patient is. I think that cybersecurity researchers should do the same thing and should be neutral in the face of the threats that we are analyzing and that we need to protect internet users from. So just before ending this talk, I'd like to take you back again to the past and spend a little time to think of how researchers that were part of the Manhattan Project worked. Because this year marks the 73rd anniversary, if we can say that, of the only time in the history of the human civilization which atomic bombs were used. So hundreds of thousands of people died in Japan because of that. And if you look at how the greatest minds in nuclear physics research worked back then, you realize that everything was very compartmentalized. Everybody was working on their own little piece of the puzzle, and somebody way up high was putting all these pieces of the puzzles together. And this made me think, because sometimes I have the feeling that the security industry is going in the same direction. It's something that worries me, because I'm thinking that what if these researchers would have had the same freedom that we have nowadays, to communicate with each other, to share the information with each other. Maybe they would have realized that they are going in a direction in which there's no return, and maybe that thousands of lives that were lost would have been spared. The internet has such power, and it's up to us if we use it or not. So, a couple of conclusions. I'm not here to judge if things such as balkanization are good or bad, and I'm not here to judge if things such as total freedom are good or bad. The only thing that I know for sure is that we as humans, we want to continuously evolve. And we can only evolve if we have real choice. And we can only have real choice if we have free access to information and unrestricted access to what's happening around the world. And what keeps me up at night is the fact that I'm looking at governments nowadays and understanding that they already have decided what kind of internet they want for themselves. They want an internet in which they have the control, they have the filtering mechanisms, and they can always say what kind of things you want to read. You are allowed to read, what kind of things you're not allowed to read, or what kind of software you're allowed to use. And I think that this is a very important moment for us as security researchers to make this decision. Like, what do we want the future of the internet to look like? What kind of internet do we want our kids to use in the future? Is it an internet in which everything is censored and surveilled and monitored, just like George Orwell's 1984? Or is it an internet in which there's free access to every kind of resource, idea, algorithm, or piece of code that the community puts out there, and things such as freedom to access all this information and freedom to have privacy and security are essentially basic human rights. So this is the question that I'd like to leave you with, and I'd like to thank you for paying attention.